All right, so are you ready to dive into a real mystery with me today?
Always up for a good mystery. Hit me with it.
Okay, so this one is the disappearance of Mary Louise Day.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at excerpts from a true crime podcast that covered this case.
All right.
And this one is really interesting because after everyone assumed Mary was gone for good,
Yeah.
someone pops up claiming to be her over 20 years later.
Oh, wow.
So,
That's going to be interesting for sure.
yeah, and it really makes you think about, how reliable is memory, especially after such a long time.
Yeah.
And the podcast really digs into the family dynamics,
Yeah.
which is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, how so?
So we have to go all the way back to 1981 in Seaside, California.
Oh.
13-year-old Mary is living with her mom, her stepfather, and siblings.
Hmm.
And the podcast paints a picture of a pretty troubled home life.
Oh. Yeah.
Talking about time and foster care allegations of abuse from the stepfather.
Oh,
It
wow.
was a rough situation.
Yeah.
And then one night, Mary vanishes.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
What happened?
The family claimed she ran away, and they said it wasn't unusual for her.
Oh, okay.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
No missing person report was ever filed.
Oh, wow.
And they even kept cashing her Social Security checks.
That's not good.
So those actions or lack of action really make you question what was going on in that household.
Yeah, it seems really suspicious, right? Like, what are they hiding?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now jump ahead to 2002. Over 2 decades later,
Okay.
Mary's sister Sher finally files that missing person report,
Oh, wow.
and the police get involved.
Mm-hmm.
But what's so striking is how the parents reacted to the investigation.
Really?
Yeah, so there's this moment in the podcast where Mary's other sister, Kathy, talks about how their parents specifically warned her to stay away from a certain part of the backyard.
Oh, my gosh.
And then you couple that with their just generally unconcerned attitude about their missing daughter.
Yeah.
It's clear why investigators started raising eyebrows.
Yeah. Big red flag there.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So they bring in cadaver dogs to search the property to try to get some answers.
Okay.
And wouldn't you know it,
What?
the dogs hit on a spot in the backyard,
Really?
suggesting that human remains might be buried there.
Oh, wow.
It felt like a major break in the case.
Yeah.
But just as the suspicion was mounting against the parents, something totally unexpected happened.
Oh, no. What happened?
A woman claiming to be Mary is found in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, my gosh.
And the podcast really emphasizes how crazy the timing was.
Yeah.
She had gotten a state ID just a few weeks before, right as this homicide investigation was picking up steam.
Wow.
It makes you wonder if there was a connection.
Definitely.
Yeah, so they even called her Phoenix Mary in the podcast.
Okay.
Now, DNA tests did confirm that she was Charlotte's daughter,
Hmm.
meaning she was at least related to Mary.
Okay.
But a lot of things just didn't add up.
Like what?
Well, this Mary had a southern accent, which the original Mary never had.
Mm-hmm.
She also said she'd been using a different name. And she seemed to have gaps in her memory about important details.
Like what kinds of details?
Well, one detail that really stuck with me was when Phoenix Mary asked the detective how they would have identified her body if they had found it.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty strange question to ask, right?
Yeah, that is really weird. It makes it sound like she knows something.
You almost have to wonder if she was playing a game or like testing the detective.
Yeah.
It definitely throws another wrench into the whole mystery.
Absolutely.
And then to make things even more confusing, she sends this cryptic email to the detective saying she'd been lying, but then she takes it back.
Oh, my gosh.
It's so hard to know what to believe at this point.
I can imagine.
But the story doesn't end there.
Oh, no.
A few years later, in 2008, cadaver dogs are brought to a second house where the family lived after Mary disappeared.
Okay.
And you guessed it, they get another hit.
Really?
This is where Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective, comes onto the scene.
Okay.
He is convinced that Mary was murdered and that the parents are covering it up.
Mm.
So Clark's theory, as the podcast explains it, is that Phoenix Mary is actually Mary's secret older sister.
Oh, wow.
He thinks the parents might have brought her in to pretend to be Mary and throw off the investigation.
That's a wild theory.
It is a pretty wild idea.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about all the strange coincidences and inconsistencies,
Right.
it doesn't seem impossible.
Yeah, I guess not.
Yeah, it's like something straight out of a movie.
Totally.
But just when you think it can't get any crazier, a new detective, Judy Velaz, takes over the case
Okay.
and re-examines everything.
Mm-hmm.
She ends up closing the case, concluding that Phoenix Mary is actually the real Mary Louise Day after all.
Wow, so she believes her.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So what's interesting is how Velaz arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, how'd she do that?
Well, she went back to the DNA testing,
Okay.
used facial recognition technology,
Mm-hmm.
and interviewed people who knew Mary after she disappeared.
Okay.
All of that seemed to back up Phoenix Mary's story. Velaz also suggests that the inconsistencies in Mary's story could be due to the trauma she experienced and her struggles with alcoholism.
Okay. That makes sense.
And there's even a story in the podcast about a specific photograph that convinced Velaz that Phoenix Mary was the real deal.
Hmm.
But even with the case officially closed, there are still some unanswered questions.
Like what?
Well, like those cadaver dog hits.
Right. It's just like even with the case closed, you still have this feeling that something's not quite right.
It is unsettling.
Yeah, like you mentioned those cadaver dog hits.
Wow.
Those were never really fully explained.
Exactly.
And then there's that statement from William,
Oh, yeah.
Mary's stepfather,
Right.
about a demon inside him potentially being responsible for her disappearance.
It's creepy. I mean, did he mean that literally, or was that a metaphor for something else?
Yeah, who knows?
It really makes you wonder what happened to Mary that night. Did she run away like the official report states, or was there something darker going on?
I think that's what makes this podcast so fascinating.
Yeah.
It doesn't try to shy away from the ambiguity,
Right.
It lays out all the facts and explores all the different theories and lets you come to your own conclusions. So
Right.
you're really left grappling with the what ifs and the impact of the trauma on everyone involved.
Well, and speaking of trauma, the podcast really highlights how Mary's difficult upbringing might have shaped her.
Right?
I mean, imagine being bounced between foster care and a troubled home and then essentially disappearing for over 2 decades.
Yeah,
It's no wonder her memories might be fragmented or her sense of self could be shaky.
exactly. It's a powerful reminder that our past experiences, especially traumatic ones, can have a huge impact on who we become.
Right.
It's not hard to see how Mary's childhood could have led to some of those inconsistencies in her story, especially if she was dealing with alcoholism on top of it.
Right. And it makes you question, was Phoenix Mary intentionally lying, or was she genuinely trying to piece together a past that she had maybe blocked out?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's a puzzle with no easy answers.
And I think that's the point.
Yeah.
This case really makes us think critically about what we consider to be the truth.
Mm-hmm.
We're presented with conflicting accounts, pieces of evidence that don't quite fit.
Right.
Ultimately, it's up to us to decide what we believe.
Well, and that's one of the things that makes true crime so captivating.
Oh, for sure.
It's not just about the crime itself,
Right.
but it's about the human element, the psychology behind it all, trying to find answers in a world that's full of messy, complicated situations.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that this case reveals some of the limitations of our justice system.
Oh, absolutely.
Despite these thorough investigations, some questions just go unanswered.
Yeah.
Did the police miss something? Did they overlook a key piece of evidence?
Right.
Those doubts can linger even after a case is officially closed.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that central question.
Yeah.
What really happened to Mary Louise Day?
Right.
And the podcast lays out several compelling theories,
It does.
each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
So, what are some of those?
Well, you have Detective Clark's theory about the secret older sister,
Right.
which is intriguing,
Yeah.
but it lacks concrete evidence.
Okay.
And then there's the official conclusion that Mary ran away and built a new life under a different name.
Mm-hmm.
That seems plausible,
Yeah.
especially given her background and the evidence that Velaz gathered.
Right.
But even Velaz admitted that some aspects of the case are unexplained, like those cadaver dog hits.
Right.
And William's near confession, while never formally admitted to Unding, still casts a shadow over the whole thing.
It's those unanswered questions that really keep this case so compelling. Even after all these years,
Right.
we're given a resolution,
We are.
but it doesn't feel completely satisfying.
I agree.
It's like finishing a puzzle but realizing there's a piece missing.
Yeah.
You can see the overall picture, but there's still a gap there.
Yeah, an emptiness.
Right.
And that's what makes this deep dive so thought-provoking.
Hmm.
It goes beyond your typical true crime story.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the ambiguity that's often present in these real-life mysteries.
Right. Because sometimes even with the best investigations and what seems like conclusive evidence,
Yeah.
some questions might just never be fully answered.
And that's okay.
Yeah, embracing the mystery, the not knowing that can be part of the process too.
Right.
It keeps us questioning, keeps us searching,
Yeah.
maybe even finding our own meaning in those unanswered questions.
I like that. So we've explored the disappearance, the investigation, the conflicting theories, the official resolution, but we can't wrap up this deep dive without talking about the human impact of this story.
Okay.
What does this case tell us about memory identity and how our past can shape us? It really makes you think about, how closely tied our identities are to our memories.
It does.
What happens when those memories are, unreliable, fragmented, maybe even completely gone?
Yeah, it's almost like Mary Louise Day became this blank canvas. Everyone involved in the case kind of projected their own ideas and theories onto her. The police saw a potential murder victim.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Clark saw an imposter.
Yeah.
Judy Vlaz saw a survivor, battling her demons.
Right. And all the while, Mary's own voice and experiences were just getting lost in the mix.
Exactly.
And for her sister, Sher,
Yeah.
who filed that report after all those years,
Right.
Mary represented a lost connection, a piece of their family that she desperately wanted to find.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to think that Mary's own story got buried under all the speculation and conflicting narratives.
It is. And the podcast does a good job of portraying her struggles with alcoholism, too.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how trauma can manifest itself in different ways,
Right?
often leading to self-destructive behaviors. It's
Yeah.
like she was trying to numb the pain of a past she couldn't remember or make sense of.
It leads to the question of, even if we do accept that Phoenix Mary was the real Mary Louise Day,
Right.
did she ever find peace?
Yep.
Did she ever find closure? Did she ever truly come to terms with her past?
It's hard to say.
We may never know the answers to those questions.
Yeah, that's true.
This case also highlights the limitations of forensic science.
In what way?
I mean, DNA testing and facial recognition technology, they played a big part in this investigation.
They did.
But even those advanced tools, they couldn't provide definitive answers to every question.
That's true. It reminds us that science can only take us so far. In the end, it often comes down to human interpretation and subjective judgment calls.
Right.
Sometimes even a leap of faith to reach a conclusion.
And those conclusions can be influenced by all sorts of factors, including just a desire for closure.
Absolutely, not just for the families, but for the investigators, too.
Right.
That need to wrap things up neatly can sometimes lead to overlooking other possibilities.
It's definitely something to keep in mind as we explore these types of cases.
For sure, especially with cases as complex as this one.
Right.
But I think even with all the uncertainties and lingering questions, there are some valuable takeaways from Mary Louise Day's story.
Like what?
Well, it reminds us that truth can be slippery, memory can be fragile, and identity is this complex and ever-evolving thing, shaped by experiences, both remembered and forgotten.
And maybe the most important takeaway
Yeah,
is that we need to approach these mysteries with empathy,
absolutely.
remembering that behind every case file and every missing person report are real people.
Yes, real people with complex lives enduring pain and searching for answers.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering, what does it really mean to solve a case?
That is the question, isn't it?
Is it about finding one definitive answer?
Right.
Or is it more about acknowledging the complexity, embracing the ambiguity, recognizing that the search for truth is this ongoing journey?
I think it's a combination of all of that.
Yeah, and to our listeners out there, as you go on to explore other true crime stories or maybe encounter real-life mysteries,
Yeah.
remember Mary Louise Day?
Right.
And let her case be a reminder that behind every headline and every investigation are real people whose lives have been deeply affected.
That's a great point. I think that's a good note to end on.
All right, well, that wraps up our deep dive today.
Thanks for having me.
Always the pleasure.